Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to give it another second for folks to join. Glad to see you this evening. We know that the Players is well underway, so lots of people are busy with lots of things. We'll go ahead and get started today. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Kim Kuda-Drang, and I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Cummer Museum of Art and Gardens, and we're so thrilled to kick off this second lecture in a three-part series, which is hosted by Cummer Beaches, an affinity group of the Cummer Museum of Art and Gardens, and is also generously sponsored by Dr. Diane Jacobsen. The title of this evening's talk is The Power of Sculpture: Masterpieces of Sculpture from Middle Ages to Modern Day in the Cummer Museum and the DeMell Jacobsen collections. So before I introduce our speaker, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording, and a recording of this talk will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. We will likely send you an email letting you know about that as well. And during the talk, there will be time for Q&A, so we'd love to hear from you. We do have the Q&A function at the bottom enabled. Our attendees will not be visible or audible, but you will have time to pop in some questions, probably at around the 45-minute mark. So feel free to do that, and we will address as many as we can this evening. With that, let me introduce you to our speaker. We're really delighted again to be with Dr. Scott Brown, Professor of Art History at the University of North Florida. And we're going to let Scott take it away from here.
Thank you so much, Kim. I'm so pleased to be here, and good evening, everyone. I think I'm competing with a country music star at the Players Championship, so I appreciate everyone who's here with me tonight. We're talking about sculpture, which is my first love, and we're talking about sculpture in the context both of the Cummer Museum's collection, some beloved favorites there at the museum, but also the Diane DeMell Jacobsen collection, in anticipation of the arrival of American Made, the show which is currently touring the nation of Dr. Jacobsen's collection. Dr. Jacobsen, who's such a good friend of the Cummer and of myself and of the city of Jacksonville, will be bringing her exhibition, American Made, to the Cummer beginning on June 9th. So in anticipation of that, I was thinking about sculpture, which is in many ways my first love as an art historian. I fell in love with sculpture as a student in college, and here are just a couple of the pieces that we're going to be looking at today. On the left, from the Cummer collection, this wonderful limewood Madonna, and on the right, the famous Nydia, the blind flower girl of Pompeii by Randolph Rogers. I'm always struck, though, when I'm in a museum looking at a work of sculpture, it's a bit like seeing an animal in the zoo, because it's a marvelous and spectacular creature, but you know that no matter how realistic the habitat, this isn't the natural environment of the wonderful creature. It's a little bit like perhaps our friend Flaco. I don't know how many of you are following the current drama of Flaco, the Eurasian eagle owl who escaped this winter from the Central Park Zoo and is on the loose in Central Park. There's something marvelous about the animal in the zoo, but there's something even more extraordinary about it in its natural environment. And so what I want to talk about tonight is just that, the natural environments of sculpture, because it is in those spaces that they often hold the most power, in which their power is most obvious to us. I fell in love with sculpture when I first saw it, as it were, in the wild. As a student, when I traveled to Europe, and I encountered in the medieval churches that still stand across the continent works of religious art still in situ, performing their ancient functions with the same majesty and mystery that they have always had. Here we're looking at the famous reliquary statue of Sainte Foy de Conques, one of the most famous sculptures of the Middle Ages, a sculpture which has performed many miracles, a sculpture which in its own way walks and talks and speaks, and like other sculptures of the Middle Ages, is animated by a kind of life that is in part divine and in part terrestrial. And this kind of power, the power of sculpture, its presence in space, its drama, its mystery, is what first drew me to the work of sculpture. Very different to encounter the same kind of object in a modern museum, which is how we do encounter, of course, most works of art. Even most works of medieval religious art today are to be found in museums like the Louvre and the Metropolitan. But in the Middle Ages, in the ancient world, even in the Renaissance, we find sculpture in a lot of spaces which are not museums, obviously. Sculptures which were designed for spaces like the doorway of the church here at this cathedral of Oloron in southern France. It's quite a marvelous site for a number of reasons. It is, among other things, one of the first places that sculpture was reborn. Sculpture as an art form died out, really vanished almost from the entire continent of Europe in the late years of antiquity. With the decline of Rome, the beginning of the Middle Ages, sculpture vanished. And it vanished in part because it was so powerful, because it was so dangerous. Sculptures were associated with idolatry and with magic of the ancient world, and were for that reason oftentimes feared and despised. That dangerous power of the sculpture took some time to mellow before 600 years after the fall of Rome, sculpture was reborn around the year 1100. We can see here in this marvelous church doorway, there is a crucifixion sculpture mounted in the tympanum space above the doorway, which is mounted, as it were, on top of this column, a column which stands upon a pair of carved captives who are bound, chained together, as though they have to be tied together by the artist to prevent them from moving away, from walking away. The sculptures exist in the doorway, literally in the space where we walk by. We're forced to confront them, these captives holding up the column, which supports not only the church, but the image of the crucifixion above it. There's a magic there that is really quite marvelous and profound. And these sculptures would be equally fascinating, perhaps in some ways, if we found them in another context. But here in their native setting, they're especially striking. They're a little bit like the famous Pygmalion sculpture of Galatea, the story of the sculpture which comes alive. And it is that life, the animus of the sculpture itself, which is so interesting to me to consider when it lived, where it lived, and how it lived. And so when we turn to our sculptures in the Cummer Museum collection, we're confronted by a number of works which are outwardly beautiful, they're marvelous, they're real treasures, but they are also works that challenge us to imagine or to remember the kinds of places where they once lived and the kinds of powers that they once held for their viewers. One of the oldest works of sculpture, one of the oldest medieval works of sculpture in the collection, is this Madonna and Child from around 1410, a limestone sculpture, and almost certainly therefore architectural. It needs a building to go with it, and probably a cathedral or chapel of some kind. It depicts the Virgin holding the child holds a little bouquet of flowers. It is, in some respects, much as we would have found it in the Middle Ages, but we have to reinstall it in the space of the church in our mind's eye to appreciate its power and significance. It is a cousin, for instance, of the Virgin of Paris in Notre Dame Cathedral, a sculpture of the 15th century, which is mounted here on a column next to the great pier of the church, just outside the entry to the choir of the church, where it is intimately involved in the activities of the church, not just, of course, the thousands of people who, when Notre Dame was open and when it is open again, pass through the cathedral to see the sights, but also, of course, the thousands and thousands and thousands of faithful who gather in the church for its services, which are still active. It was, in fact, for me, a mass in Notre Dame de Paris on a Sunday in June in 1996 that confirmed my decision to become an art historian. One of the most magical and extraordinary environments in the world to encounter a living work of ancient sculpture manifesting its active power in the divine mystery of religious ceremony. This statue of the Virgin of Paris itself, though, is one that requires us to do a little bit of restoration to understand how it might have looked hundreds of years ago to its viewers, because it was almost undoubtedly painted, as we can see here in a 15th century miniature painting depicting the nobleman Guy de Talleyrand kneeling before a similar statue of the Virgin and Child in a chapel. And in this space, mounted on columns surrounding the statue of the Virgin, we see other statues of saints, of John the Baptist and St. Peter with his keys and Paul with his sword, all of them in full color. This isn't just the artist's imagination. These works of art were colored. They were brilliantly, vividly colored, as we can see, for instance, in the remnants of painting and polychromy that adorn a couple of other contemporaneous sculptures of the Virgin and Child, very similar to the one in our Cummer Museum. On the left at the Metropolitan, and on the right at the Cleveland Museum of Art. We're not accustomed today to seeing painted sculpture. It seems to our eyes almost gauche and perhaps unattractive. But this is, of course, the power of the eye, sculptural eye in the Middle Ages. Its proximity to our own bodies, its similarity and its richness, because color was a form of richness that gave additional power and status to these sculptures. Our own sculpture, if we go look, we can see it's been pretty well cleaned, which is what dealers often do in the modern era when they sell sculptures, especially back in the 19th century. If we go look, though, in the creases of the Virgin's dress, we can see a little remnant of vivid carmine polychromy there. And if we look, for instance, at the foundation, the base of the statue, there's lingering remnants of blue and red polychromy, which indicate that our statue also was painted. Across the hall across the room from this statue of the Virgin is a Peter Breuer limewood Pietà, a wooden sculpture depicting the Virgin and the dead Christ who's been removed from the cross. One of the most important stories of late medieval art, as it might have appeared in context in the 15th century. Here we have the Franciscan Church of Bratislava in Slovakia, where a similarly dated 15th century Pietà is mounted in a niche in the church. This is a work which would have been considered not simply a work of art, but much more than that, in fact, a profound site of devotion, of contact with the suffering of the mother and the image of the wounds of Christ, a place in which imagination and the work of art help us to transcend the present in order to connect with the profound past. Our own Peter Breuer, the same sculptor who carved the work in the Cummer Museum, has a couple of other surviving images of the Pietà, including one which is still in situ in the Marienkirche in Zwickau in Germany. As you can see on the left, it is richly and vividly painted, and perhaps even grotesquely painted, because the wounds of Christ bleed and the viscous blood drains and trickles over the contours of the body in a way that is intended to produce a connection with the body, to emphasize and to empathize with the viewer. Here, a Peter Breuer Man of Sorrows, which is really quite remarkably disfigured by streaks of blood and small wounds that refer to the flagellation of Christ, the whipping of Christ before his death, and to the wounds from the crown of thorns. I think we have to imagine that our own sculpture in the Cummer Museum was likewise painted, and perhaps quite alarming to look at initially, a sculpture that was intended to emphasize pain and suffering and the drama of the Virgin's sorrow and the drama of Christ's death. In fact, when we look very closely at the wounds in Christ's feet, the nail holes, we can see here the lingering remnants of red pigment, which indicate that most certainly our Peter Breuer was also painted. we cross back over the room to Nicholas Weckmann the Elder's Madonna and Child. Here we encounter another problem. This beautiful, rich wooden limewood sculpture. Limewood or linden wood is the preferred sculptural material of 15th, 16th century Germany. It's the iconic linden tree of Germany, a very fine-grained, very durable, very beautiful wood. But all of that wood was painted for most of the history of the Middle Ages. As much as we appreciate the materiality of it today, we are more likely to have encountered Mick Weckmann's sculpture in something like this. Here's another version, Nicholas Weckmann the Elder, Madonna and Child from 1520, gilded and painted and really vividly colorful. Our sculpture is a little different, though. I don't think it was mounted on a pedestal like the one we just saw. It's flat-backed, and in fact, that is an indication, as we can see here in the sculpture on the right by Weckmann, a panel that was originally part of an altarpiece, that our sculpture likewise probably was part of a larger ensemble. In fact, if we look closely at the foot, the toe of the Virgin here, there's a little socle with a dowel hole, which indicates that our sculpture was quite clearly joined to something else next to it. In fact, I suspect our sculpture was part of an altarpiece, rather more like this one by Nicholas Weckmann from the Middle Ages here in Mannheim in Germany, the Rother altarpiece, with at the center the image of the Virgin and Child and adjacent statue sculptures mounted in a kind of shallow box-like frame. Finally, in the Cummer collection from the ancient, in the medieval period, very tail end of what we might consider the medieval period, we have this marvelous Saint Longinus sculpture by Philipp Jakob Straub, which is again undoubtedly a religious artwork, which was meant to be viewed in a devotional context in a church. Longinus is a saint associated with the crucifixion. He's a little bit of a legendary saint. He is the centurion who pierces Christ's side with a spear, and in that act is converted when he perceives the divinity of Christ as he pierces his side. That story of Longinus is treated famously by Bernini in one of his sculptures for St. Peter's of the Vatican Church, 1638. You can see the difference here. Bernini's sculpture is not painted, whereas our gilded Longinus, on the other hand, is really strikingly at odds with our modern notions of the colorless material forward presence of sculpture. Bernini's sculpture reminds us that there's a transition taking place. In fact, very famous and very important artists like Bernini began to insist that their sculptures not be painted. Michelangelo is another early adopter of the non-painted sculpture. And because the idea of carving this marvelous work and then having a second-rate painter come and slap some paint on it was really appalling to artists like Bernini and Michelangelo, even if that was what the style and the taste of the time really appreciated. So Bernini insists that his work remain unpainted, which it is. On the other hand, even the little terracotta study that Bernini created for his Longinus was gilded. And so Bernini himself was not opposed to colorful sculpture. He just didn't want his finished work to be disfigured in that way. Here is finally from the 18th century, another a Polish Longinus who is from the same period. So having recontextualized these medieval sculptures, as we go forward to the modern period, our Longinus undoubtedly probably participated originally in a sculptural group like this, a large life-size sculptural installation depicting the crucifixion, I suspect. But as we move forward to the present, as we talk about now American and modern sculpture, as we will see in the DeMell Jacobsen collection, we confront a different challenge of contextualizing sculpture, of placing it back in its intended setting, of letting the animal out of the zoo and returning it to its native habitat. Because the habitat has changed, of course. In America, which we might say American art begins in acts of iconoclasm and destruction. Here is an image of the destruction of the statue of George III at Bowling Green, a painting by William Walcott from the mid-19th century. The beginning of America is a beginning in iconoclasm and the rejection of kings and gods imposed on the people. And those, of course, are the two main things that people have always made sculptures of: gods and kings. In America of the early 19th century, people had really no use for such things. And in a society of iconoclasts and of Protestants and of freedom of religion, naturally, of course, sculpture must change yet again. It doesn't disappear, but it does transform. There are in the Jacobsen collection 4 or 5 marvelous sculptures which serve as a fantastic survey of the history of sculpture in America. Works by Hiram Powers and by Randolph Rogers, by Augustus St. Gaudens, by Bessie Potter Vana, that we'll look at here in turn. Each of these sculptors is from a different generation, one generation right after the other, and each represents a new turn in the American taste and imagination for sculpture. Hiram Powers is perhaps the first famous sculptor, truly famous sculptor in America. And he's a very interesting figure here. The work in the Jacobsen collection, Proserpine, which we will see probably in the exhibition at the Cummer, is one of the most famous works of American sculpture. It was, by every measure, Hiram Powers' most successful work. It is one that competes with another work by Powers as one of the most famous works of sculpture of the 19th century. Hiram Powers' Greek Slave from 1843, which was carved at almost exactly the same moment as Proserpine, is a work that really galvanized the American public. It represents maybe at that point in time the single most famous work of sculpture. It was designed by Powers not for a museum, not for a home, not for a church. It was designed in an entirely new and a very modern way to be toured as a sculpture for exhibition. And that is exactly what happened. In 1843, 1844, the Greek Slave went on tour and remained on tour for many years. He produced 6 full-size copies of this, which toured in different directions. And the Greek Slave arrived in America on the cusp of the Civil War at a moment when it spoke profoundly to its public in very different ways and directions. And obviously, in the context of the lead up to the Civil War, it became a flashpoint for the abolitionist movement. Hiram Powers himself was an abolitionist, and the Greek Slave was, I think we may be safe in calling it, the first really public representation of slavery, and it was shocking. It takes the pretense of a Greek Caucasian enslaved woman from the context of the battle, the war between the Turks and the Greeks of the earlier 19th century. And Hiram Powers imagines that this Greek woman has been enslaved by the Turkish overlords of Greece and has been sold in one of the slave markets of the Middle East. That is the imagination behind the sculpture. But in America, it was received very much as a parable of slavery and as a cri de coeur for abolition. It was a work that excited in every city that it went to, huge crowds. Hundreds of thousands of people across the country went to go see it. It was a work that was transformative in terms of the public's engagement with a work of art and with a work of sculpture. It was one of the first nude sculptures to be exhibited in America as well. And there was a great deal of interest in the work that brought further attention to Hiram Powers and made Hiram Powers perhaps the most successful artist of his generation, perhaps at least the most successful sculptor. His Proserpine, which is carved at almost the same time, takes very much the same theme. Hiram Powers was a spiritualist, a Swedenborgian. He was interested, he did perform seances and communed with the dead. And in all of a series of images that he produced here during the 1840s, he's interested in this idea of captivity, of the Greek slave, of Proserpine, who is the goddess Persephone, or Proserpine, the goddess of spring, who is the daughter of Ceres, the goddess of the harvest. And she is famously, in Greek mythology, abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld and forced to marry her captor, a story that has echoes, of course, in the story of the Greek slave. And so here, Proserpine is imprisoned in Hades, but she comes back 6 months of the year, and this is the renewal, the rebirth of spring. She is framed by ivy, which is the symbol of the dead, but also of eternity and everlasting life. As we see here, for instance, in a treatment of the same subject by the artist Dante Gabriel Rossetti, she holds the pomegranate, the fruit of Hades and the underworld, and the ivy here in the background. Ginevra, a story of a romantic poem about a woman who falls into a chest which locks itself, and she is imprisoned on the very day of her marriage, and she isn't discovered until many decades later. A story of imprisonment, again, of Eve, this from the same era, Eve disconsolate, who is imprisoned as Hiram Powers had it by sin, and of the Greek mythological figure Psyche, who is a symbol of the soul imprisoned in the body itself. These are all works which are about, in many ways, about Hiram Powers' spiritual beliefs. He was also a phrenologist, and he believed that the images that he made manifested in the shapes of the bodies, and especially the shapes of the face and the skull, the spiritual and the moral values that he wished to communicate in his sculptures. He encouraged his clients to have their sculptural busts read by phrenologists, and the sculptures that he produced, in particular the Proserpine, were influenced by seances in his contact with the spirits of the dead, which then manifested themselves in his sculptures. In terms of where we would encounter these works, he produced many copies of the Proserpine, which was perhaps the most successful sculpture of its era. It was much in demand in America, in particular, among private buyers. It would be found in the parlors and houses of individuals, where it conveyed not only an aesthetic, but also the spiritual context and belief, not in a traditional religious context or setting, but in a new 19th century free-thinking, spiritually open tradition. The 19th century was an era of spiritual seeking and transformation in American life. So here we see the integral character, though, of art in the home in the 19th century. And many of the works that we're looking at were works that were designed for domestic spaces, where they would take on powerful values as symbols of family, of spirituality, of home and domestic identity. Here is one of the busts, a plaster bust by Hiram Powers of one of his clients, who was much sought after as a portrait artist. You can see that here, drawing the hair back from the head, he, in the spirit of his interest in phrenology, allows the viewer to see the shape of the skull and the distinctive bone structure of the face. No fancy hairstyles for Hiram Powers. He was interested in conveying this inner soulful personality through the structures of the face. Randolph Rogers, a sculptor of a generation after Hiram Powers, represents a very different concept. Here is an artist now who is less of a spiritual seeker and more of an American myth maker. He, like Powers, was a sculptor who came of age and worked most of his career in Italy. These are American expatriate sculptors. Hiram Powers lived in Florence, and Randolph Rogers lived in Rome. The sculpture of Nydia like Proserpine, is one of the absolutely most successful, most important works of 19th century art, was proclaimed in its day as the most important sculpture of its generation. The story of Nydia is one that is taken from a novel written in the early 19th century. The novel being the Last Days at Pompeii, a hugely important and very popular novel, which recounted a fictionalized account of the destruction of Pompeii by Vesuvius. Pompeii itself was a subject of tremendous popularity. Nydia in this story is the protagonist, the tragic heroine, who is a blind and humble flower girl who toils in the streets of Pompeii selling flowers. In the story, Nydia is in love with the beautiful Greek suitor Glaucus, who's a handsome and well-to-do patrician, a man who she can never have. And she ends up saving him and Glaucus's true love, Ione. She is thus a figure of selflessness. And she is a person, the story hinges on the fictional detail that she's a person who can navigate Pompeii in the darkness of the ash, in the midst of the eruption, when everyone else is at their wits' end. The poor blind flower girl can still find her way around. This sculpture would have been found, like Proserpine, in the parlors and the hallways of well-to-do upper middle class and wealthy homes in America. Here we are in the hallway of Alexander Turney Stewart in his house, one of the great art collectors of the 19th century, with Nydia, as you can see, leaning forward in the background in the distance. In the American home, a statue of Nydia signifies something really, I think, quite interesting. It's a story which is about American grit and persistence. That is, we are taking Nydia now as a distinctly American subject. In fact, she was hugely popular in America and relatively unknown as a subject of art outside of America. Randolph Rogers' work was, even though he worked in Europe, sold primarily in America. And Americans on the grand tour in Europe made Rogers Studios a primary tourist destination where they would go and order their copy of Nydia to be transported back to the United States. Nydia becomes a kind of figure of the new American identity. The story of Glaucus and Nydia is one in which you have this humble protagonist who's morally virtuous, who's gritty, determined, who's capable, but is not wealthy, not rich, not highborn. She was turned into a heroine of plays and operas. The story of the Last Days at Pompeii was hugely successful and performed in operas and plays around the world. But especially perhaps in America, Pompeii was a popular fantasy. James Payne's Last Days at Pompeii was a touring fireworks pyrodrama that was running for decades between the 1880s and the early 20th century. Here we see a performance on Coney Island in 1903. In our sculpture in the Jacobsen collection, the image of Nydia is one which is really quite spectacular at a technical level. You can see why this sculpture appealed to people. The treatment of the drapery, wind-blown, we can imagine here the heat and the pyroclastic flow and the wind from the action of the volcano erupting, blowing through the streets of Pompeii. They whip up the draperies of Nydia into this froth of marble. It's kind of amazing that you can take stone and turn it into such a fluid and liquid and active and lively form. And the artist contrasts that busyness and the fluidity of the drapery with the lithic solidity of the capital, which lies on the ground at Nydia's feet. Now, that capital is there as a structural support. It's disguised a big piece of marble connected integrally to the body of Nydia in order to stabilize the figure. It would otherwise be quite fragile, especially at the ankles. But it's disguised as a Corinthian capital. I think that's a very symbolic act. It's not just a practical support. The Corinthian capital symbolizes the whole order of antiquity, of Pompeii, of this decadent Roman pagan society, the richest society in the world, but one that in American mythmaking, we might think of again as decadent, as having lost its way, especially as a society that doesn't appreciate the merit and the virtue of poor Nydia until it is too late. And here, that image of the old order, the capital, the Corinthian order, is toppled and fallen on the ground, and it is up to Nydia to find her way, blind, through the streets of the city to rescue Glaucus. The attention to the face here, a face which is not overly idealized, and subtle irregularities and slight differences, non-ideal qualities of scale in the face and the nose, and in particular the mask of concentration is important to our understanding of the sculpture. Nydia is not concerned for appearances. She represents instead a kind of mythical American determination, grit, a need to do and to succeed against the odds here, that is makes Nydia a kind of prototype for the idea of modern American humility, modesty, grit, determination, set against a backdrop in which the old world of Europe now represents Pompeii, an old world taken to be in decline, and America here with its gritty determination rising to save it and to protect it. A myth, of course, that plays out again and again over the course of the 20th century in our stories of war and the relationship of America to Europe. It's a marvelous sculpture, and one that then gives way to something else entirely different only a generation later, when we turn to Augustus St. Gaudens, who is one generation after Randolph Rogers, the greatest sculptor, certainly of the Gilded Age, the first truly great American monumental sculptor. For much of the 19th century, America had little use for big monuments, and we simply didn't make that many big statues and sculptures. It's that old puritanical and revolutionary zeal for knocking down statues of kings and gods. But St. Gaudens comes at the moment in time when America is open again to thinking big. His sculpture as bronze cast of the Puritan is, like the ones before us that we've just talked about, one of the single most important and influential sculptures of the 19th century. It is arguably St. Gaudens' most famous work, but it is also definitely one of the single most successful works in terms of the number of copies produced by the artist in the course of his career. There was a huge demand, a huge appetite for this work, just as for Nydia and Proserpine earlier. St. Gaudens began his career doing very tiny work. He was a cameo carver by training initially, but he came of age, as I said, as a sculptor at the moment when America began to go big in the Gilded Age. He carved this wonderful mantelpiece for the Vanderbilt mansion, which is a sign of even bigger things to come. His famous Diana statue is perhaps was the most celebrated sculpture of the late 19th century when it debuted. The original was 18 feet high. It was commissioned to go atop the tallest building in Manhattan, the tower of the old Madison Square Gardens. In fact, the Madison Square Gardens wasn't the tallest building in Manhattan at the time, but when you stuck the Diana statue on top, it became the tallest building in Manhattan. So that made the Diana then a spectacular tourist attraction, and people came from all around to see her. Here we have a postcard from 1893, and you can see just up there at the top, that little image of Diana. But Diana was actually a weather vane, and she turned with the wind. It was a marvelous, spectacular work of sculpture that he produced many reduced copies of for sale. Augustus St. Gaudens is also the carver of the sculpture of William Tecumseh Sherman in Grand Army Plaza in New York. and the sculptor of the Deacon Samuel Chapin Memorial in Merrick Park in Springfield, Massachusetts, which debuted in 1887. This was a really important commission for St. Gaudens. It was to commemorate Deacon Samuel Chapin, himself a Puritan, one of the sort of descendants of the original Mayflower pilgrims, and a figure thus who is deeply intertwined with our concepts of American history. The work was commissioned by one of Chapin's descendants to decorate a new park in Springfield, Massachusetts. You can see here an early postcard. The park was designed by the architect Stanford White, a frequent collaborator of Augustus St. Gaudens, and it was designed to be placed right in the heart of downtown, gritty, dirty, industrial downtown Springfield, in a working class neighborhood filled with people who worked in the nearby factories. That was originally Stern Square, but interestingly enough, people didn't like the sculpture. It became rapidly a target for vandalism, and they couldn't keep it clean. The little boys dug the lead out of the foundation to make sinker lines for fishing lures, and they had no respect for this old puritanical figure. And so after a few years, the city fathers moved the sculpture to nearby Merrick Park, where it could be safer and more protected. There's a moral lesson here that even in 1890s America, in some places, people were not ready yet for these monumental statues of gods and kings. And making here the Puritan into this godlike man was itself provocative to these working class Catholic immigrants who lived in the immediate neighborhood around the original Stearns Park. To be fair, St. Gaudens' statue of Deacon Samuel Chapin is not entirely flattering to the deacon. It is a sculpture which represents, as everyone notes, this stern and sort of implacable man. He is austere and intense, and that giant cape which he wears is so fascinating. What an interesting part of the sculpture to me. It reminds me a little bit of some of those animals that puff themselves up when threatened to make them look bigger. He's also rather puffy. He fills out his vest quite well, but here is this big, stern, implacable figure. He always reminds me a little bit of a medieval sculpture known as the Madonna of Mercy, in which the image of the Virgin Mary opens her cloak, a bit like the Puritan, in order to gather in the lost souls and to protect them, and people cluster together in the cloak folds of the Virgin for protection. But there is nothing about the Puritan there on the left that seems really inviting to us to go and to hide amongst the folds of his cape. He is rather stern, driven, intense, implacable. And it's that quality which made him so successful as well to a certain breed of art collector in the early 20th century. The sculpture in the Diane Jacobsen collection is a fascinating one because it is inscribed to its original owner, George Woodward of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Association. This sculpture was commissioned from Augustus St. Gaudens as a gift to George Woodward on his retirement, presumably, after a career well spent. Here, the Puritan is an image which now will adorn the house of this man of business, this himself strong, implacable, determined man of business and capitalist affairs in early 20th century America. Woodward's claim to fame at the Metropolitan Life Insurance Association was that he designed a particularly lucrative life insurance policy aimed at a middle-class population that had not been buying whole life before. And so there you have it. In a word, the Protestant work ethic at play in Deacon Samuel Chapin's Puritan, which adorned the house of George Woodward. Bessie Pottervana rounds out our trio of artists from the Jacobsen collection. The first woman in the group, not of course the first woman artist, but perhaps the first truly great woman sculptor in American art. Bessie Potter Vanna was a celebrity, quite successful in her own right, one of the most successful artists of her age, of any gender. And a generation after Augustus St. Gaudens. She produced quite small works. She was not like the Augustus St. Gaudens, this thrusting giant monumental sculptor. On the contrary, she produced small works designed for the home, but they were transformative and considered by critics of the day to be revolutionary, even to be profoundly modern, precisely because they did not take as their subjects gods or goddesses or mythological stories or fictional figures. In fact, just the contrary. They aimed to do nothing other than to represent real but anonymous people in ordinary contexts, and in particular to represent women. And this is Bessie Potter Vanna's Girl Dancing, a variation on a theme. And a number of works by her. Here is Vanna in her studio, which give you a sense of the scale of some of her works. These are works which are very much designed for the home and in the spirit of a democratic value in which there was a belief by Vanna and others of her generation that everyone should have access to art, that it shouldn't be so fine or so valuable or so costly or so exclusive that people of relatively ordinary means couldn't have access to daily beauty. A work like Allegresse, for instance, might have adorned a fairly ordinary upper middle class home. Vanna was inspired in her work by, among other things, ancient Greek Tanagra figurines, which were an absolute sensation in the late 19th century. These were, just like Vanna's sculptures, they were images of ordinary women, not mythologized, not divine, not gods, not kings, small and humble, and especially terracotta. They were made out of clay, and so were relatively cheaply produced and inexpensive. They were, by Vanna and other women artists and scholars of her generation, also presumed to be carved by women or to be produced by women a lot of the time. And so Vanna took many of her inspirations from those Tanagra figurines. Bessie Potter Vanna called her works potterines, partly in reference to the idea of the Tanagra potters, these women who worked with clay, producing Tanagra figurines. The Tanagra figurines inspired other artists of the era. For instance, Edgar Degas' experiments with small-scale sculpture were inspired by Tanagra figurines. But Bessie Potter Vanna is perhaps the greatest interpreter in sculpture of the Tanagra figurine, which is a very profoundly important example of art for America in the late 19th and early 20th century, because it represented in some ways an egalitarian ideal of art, humble, popular art, accessible to many people at many different social classes, one without an off-putting or an elitist content connected to gods and power. Its power, rather, is that it represents humble, ordinary people in ordinary and everyday contexts, but in contexts that give power to beauty, in this case, to familiar and everyday beauty. We can see here in some of Vanna's sculptures the images of young women, young mothers here, given an exalted but small-scale status as subjects of an art which endows them with beauty and presence in the American home. We'll conclude finally with another artist in the Cummer collection, the great Augusta Savage, who is yet one more generation later than Bessie Potter Vanna, and in many ways follows in her tradition as a woman, as a sculptor who also gives voice and power to subjects which had been neglected, ignored, and discredited before. Augusta Savage is, of course, our hometown hero and a native of Jacksonville. We'll claim her as a native of Jacksonville. And the greatest, one of the greatest sculptors of the 20th century and African-American women sculptors. Her most popular work, her arguably most successful work, is a copy of which exists in the Cummer collection, is Gammon. And just like Bessie Potter Vana's works, it's a sculpture that gives importance and value and significance to an otherwise anonymous subject. The word gamin in French, gamin, it just means kid, essentially. It's generic. It is relatively anonymous. We might translate it as scamp, little rascal. It is, however, a word that does not refer to any specific person. This is not a story of Nydia. This is not Proserpine. There's no mythology. There's no fiction. It is rather a work that asks us to see the subject simply as a person, a real person, not mythologized or idealized, but given to us as a subject worthy of our consideration, aesthetically worthy of our consideration of its presence in our space. And this was a very successful work. Augusta Savage, who was a great sculptor, but who struggled because of her time, the time in America, and because of the cost of casting things in bronze, often struggled to turn her plaster models into bronzes. Actually produced quite a few copies of this work in bronze, which speaks to its popularity and its critical success. It is an incredibly intimate work that connects us directly to the subject and that gives significance to something that is often ignored in our great histories of art. That is youth, the child itself is a subject that's often neglected. I'm often asked what the earliest representation of children, other than Jesus Christ, are in the history of art in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And really, it's not until the 16th century that we begin to see any treatment of children that might resonate with our understanding of them as real subjects of art. But here in this image, we have the gamin before us and its cousin, the bronze diving boy, which is part of the original Nina Cummer bequest, which is a work that Nina acquired from Augusta Savage directly. And here, just to conclude, we see it as it would have been seen in the Cummer Garden, 1975. Now, when we go into the galleries, we'll find it again like an animal in the zoo on display. But not terribly long ago, we would have found it in its natural environment there above the reflecting pool in Nina's garden, which gives us a sense of the way that we live with these sculptures. We can live again with them in our imagination, I think. If we use a little bit of our eyes and a little bit of our minds to think about how these works were found, how they were encountered, how they meant and signified to their audiences in the past. So thank you so much, and I look forward now to taking your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom. Yes, sculpture gardens. So thank you so much for that question. The sculpture gardens, of course, have a long history. And if we went back into the Renaissance, we would find in Italy marvelous, fabulous private sculpture gardens, many of which, of course, still exist and can be visited today. And in those gardens, we would find a mixture of antiquities and modern sculptures. But sculpture gardens are very much an expression of power and of private ownership. Today, of course, we have a number of beautiful sculpture gardens in this country, which are now open and can be visited. But historically, at least, the garden and the sculpture garden itself is another way of articulating personal power and narratives of personal history. The garden space of the manors and castles and estates of the Renaissance and the early modern period are the reference point for that. In the United States, of course, there are many wonderful private houses, now public museums, which have sculpture gardens connected to them. The diving boy, another question here, would have been moved relatively recently, and our curators can tell us more about this, because of course of preservation issues. And this is the trade-off that we have to consider, is that outside the elements and modern pollution are not very kind to our sculptures. And so we have to walk a fine line between questions of preservation and conservation and our responsibility to care for these things, and to consider the environments in which they would have been originally displayed and seen. The painted sculptures that I showed earlier in my talk, the question is, were the painted sculptures I showed from Germany restored, or is that the original paint? This is a fabulous question. These are sculptures that would undoubtedly have been painted many, many times. In fact, medieval sculptures, oftentimes the greatest expense of producing works of sculpture was not the work of carving, but the work of painting over and over and over again. Because in the environment of the medieval church, lit by candles and filled with incense, things got pretty smoke darkened pretty quickly. And of course, there were no don't touch signs in medieval churches. People touched and loved and kissed and held and fondled these sculptures. And so they wore away pretty quickly, the paint, and repainting them was a necessary task. In some cases, we may be looking at medieval polychromia or painting that goes back a long ways, especially some of the works that I showed that had badly damaged or degraded polychromia. We can say that those are probably, if not original, they're old paint layers. But most of the works that we looked at would have been repainted many times. And from the point of view of the public, when did the eye that all truly classically beautiful sculpture and architecture, when did the idea become that it must be white, austere, unpainted? And as I alluded, that's a great question. As I alluded to in my discussion of Bernini, there came a time in actually the late 15th, early 16th century, when some artists, really important artists like Michelangelo in Germany, Tilman Riemenschneider, a name that may not be a household name today, but artists who were very famous for their skill and ability, they could command contracts which guaranteed their works would not be painted. It was actually a matter of contract and stipulated in contract, for instance, in Tilman Riemenschneider's works. He didn't want some hack painter coming and glopping paint on top of his delicate carving. So we begin to get, at that point in the Renaissance, a new idea of the sculpture, not just as an object of religious power and meaning, but as an object of aesthetic power. And those two are in very much conflict with each other for many generations thereafter. Sometimes aesthetic power has the upper hand and sometimes religious power does. So as we move into the modern age, especially after the Reformation and after religious art becomes a difficult and controversial concept, in European history, we find that the unpainted sculpture, the sculpture which reveals the quality of the artist's hand, that becomes paramount. And by the time we get to the 19th century, as we begin to find people collecting medieval and Renaissance art, that's when we start to clean those old medieval works to make them look, return them to an unpainted condition, to make them look like people expected. By the early 19th century, the idea of producing painted sculpture would have been considered unthinkable and really grotesque, really. So can you talk more about the process and the comments about paint slapped onto the sculptures? Yeah, so it's really interesting. The process of painting these sculptures was very important. I say slapping it on, but painting the sculpture was an extremely important task. It was taken very seriously. There was, for instance, I'll cite an example of a very famous sculpture in Lucca, Italy, known as the Volto Santo, a very famous miracle-working sculpture that was, according to legend, carved by the biblical Nicodemus, who was actually present at the crucifixion. That's a legend. But it was a painted sculpture. And so this very famous sculpture that was supposed to have been carved by Nicodemus got repainted every few years at great cost. There was, in fact, a whole fraternity, a fraternal organization like the Rotary Club that was organized just to maintain and collect funds to repaint this sculpture every so often. It was such an important sculpture that they wanted to make sure that it was always fresh looking for the tourists and the visitors who came to see it. That's just an amazing idea for us today when you think of our notions of authenticity and our notions of beauty inherited from the Renaissance, when the idea of having someone who's not the original artist come and repaint it all the time is just the opposite of what we think of as authenticity. And these were talented painters in their own right, but we have to be honest that they were essentially craftsmen. They were not themselves creative artists, but artists who specialized in applying paint to wooden sculptures, a little bit like fancy house painters. And what are our thoughts, my thoughts today on sculpture today, which is very diverse, 3D printed sculptures and sculptures in mixed media and very diverse forms. My thoughts are, just as I said today, I'll say that sculpture is a living thing. It's really the most challenging medium in many ways for viewers, because every sculpture in some level is designed for a place, to have a presence in a space. It has a purpose, a mission, and that's part of its power. And so we have to accept all sculptures in whatever forms, materials we find them, where we find them, as animals in the wild, as it were. We have pretty active debates in our society today about public sculptures, because sculpture is one of those art forms that is designed really for public consumption in some way, whether it's the great monumental sculptures of Augustus St. Gaudens out in the wide open, or whether it's Bessie Potter-Vana's sculptures in the domestic space. These are works which are for exhibition, for display in a very public sort of way. I always tell my students, sculpture is something that, because it's three-dimensional, it exercises a power simply by forcing us to circumnavigate it. It takes up space. If you're in the galleries, you have to walk around it. You have to be careful not to bump it. It is a thing that is like an eruption in space, as one of my great art historian heroes said. So I have no a priori thoughts, I guess, on the shape of modern sculpture, except to say that however we find it and wherever we find it, we can find in it, in its place, in its space, its presence, a reflection on our own assumptions about the power of sculpture. I think, just if I have to comment on it, I'll say one of my favorite works, and everyone's favorite works perhaps, is the famous bean sculpture in Chicago. And that's an example, I would say, of a completely non-traditional and really quite extraordinary work that demonstrates the continuing living power of sculpture, its hold over our imagination and its grip on our sense of presence and space. And let's see, I mentioned copies being cast or made by sculptors as being a mark of demand or success. Yes. Is there any cachet to the first casting or a way to track them? So this is a great question. And also, how do the Cummer copies fit into any value system here, such as gammon? So this is a really great question. And sometimes, of course, there are ways of tracking this. There are numbered copies and casts. Sculpture is itself an art form. We don't often think of this, but an art form that is designed for reproduction. If we look at the ancient world and the ancient sculptures of the Greeks and the Romans, most of the sculptures that we know from antiquity are actually Roman copies after Greek originals. The Capitoline Venus and the Venus de Milo and all of these other works, they are works that were not, in that sense, unique. In fact, the Romans engineered analog systems for reproducing works of art, works of sculpture. And our own sculptures that we've talked about today, Hiram Powers, Randolph Rogers, Bessie Potter-Vana, and even Augustus Savage, certainly Augustus St. Gaudens, these are all artists who really, they worked in a plastic medium like plaster or ceramic. And when you produce a sculpture, whether it's a marble or a bronze, especially a bronze. These are works that are produced from models or maquettes that are produced by the actual artist's hand, especially when we talk about bronze, for instance, and Diving Boy is a good example. Bronze casting is an industrial process that requires many, many hands, many people working together to work from a mold that is created from an original study by the artist. And so the translation of the original work into the finished product is one that facilitates the production of copies. And that's how in the 19th century and the early 20th century, many American sculptors made their money, was by producing copies after an original. For instance, Hiram Powers produced bust copies of the Greek slave. Only produced a small number of these traveling full-scale copies. Most people didn't want a huge full-scale statue. They didn't have space for it in their homes. But bust portraits of the Greek slave were produced in more numerous copies. The Proserpine sculpture is perhaps his most numerically successful sculpture. And I think it's important for us as a sign of how important a work of art was. The fact that there are 77 copies of Proserpine or something like that is itself a sign of how powerful, how impactful, how important this work was. That demand tells us something about our own history and our own appetites for art, our interests in works of art. And Gammon, our copy of Gammon, is a plaster version of Gammon, which would have been one of the preparatory studies that Augusta Savage produced for casting, in anticipation of casting. So even in the production of marble copies, although it's a less industrial process than bronze casting, there were many workmen involved in the production of the work of art. And so it wasn't Hiram Powers or Randolph Rogers back there by himself with a hammer and a chisel, but many, many trained assistants. This is one reason why both artists worked in Italy, is because there was a long tradition of stone carving in Italy, and there they found both ready access to materials, marble, but also to trained workmen who could facilitate their workshops. So on that note, that is our last question. I will say thank you so much. Thank you for wonderful questions. Thank you for participating in our talk, and join us again for our final Jacobsen talk in this three-part series in June, after the opening of American Made at the Cummer Museum on June 9th. I look forward to that. I just saw the show in Memphis at the Dixon, and I can tell you it is spectacular. So come and join us at the museum for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you all for joining us.